The relentless summer sun beat down on Violet Brooks as she stood before her husband's grave, the third one she'd visited in 5 years. The parched earth of Promise Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878, seemed to mock her tears as the townsfolk kept their distance, whispering behind gloved hands and parasols. At 26, Violet was becoming a legend of sorts, the kind no woman wanted to be. 3 husbands dead before 30, Violet heard Mabel Thornton mutter to her companion. That woman's got the angel of death riding her shadow. Violet clutched her simple black shawl tighter around her shoulders. She'd heard the whispers for years now, first after losing William to pneumonia just 6 months into their marriage, then after Thomas fell from his horse and broke his neck 2 years later. Now, with Everett barely cold in the ground after a mining accident, the whispers had turned to outright superstition. The funeral gathering dispersed quickly, leaving Violet alone with Reverend Parker, who awkwardly patted her shoulder. "Mrs. Brooks, if you need anything." "Thank you, Reverend." "I'll manage." Her voice was steady despite the hollow ache in her chest. Not just grief for Everett, who had been kind if not passionate, but for the life that seemed determined to leave her stranded on the shores of loneliness. As she turned to leave, she noticed a tall figure lingering by the cemetery gate, hat in hand. Garrett Lancaster stood with his eyes fixed on her, his expression unreadable. She'd seen him around town since he'd arrived 6 months ago to take over the struggling Lancaster ranch from his uncle. Their paths had crossed at the general store and church socials, but they'd exchanged no more than polite nods. Violet lowered her gaze and walked briskly past him, feeling his eyes follow her as she made her way down Promise Creek's dusty main street toward the small dress shop she owned. The shop had been her salvation after William died, giving her purpose and independence rare for women in these parts. It had sustained her through each subsequent loss, thread and fabric becoming the constants in her world of impermanence. That evening, as Violet closed up shop, her friend Eliza Woodson slipped through the door just before she turned the key. "I brought you some supper," Eliza said, holding up a cloth-covered basket. "Can't have you wasting away." Violet managed a small smile. "You're too good to me." They climbed the narrow stairs to the small apartment above the shop where Violet had returned after Everett's death. The mining company house had gone to the next worker in line, as was custom. "The whole town's talking about it," Eliza said as she unpacked the basket, laying out cornbread and stew. "About Everett's accident? No, about Garrett Lancaster. He fired that foreman of his, the one who's been running the ranch into the ground, and announced he's keeping the place after all. Everyone thought he'd sell and go back east." Violet stirred her stew without interest. "I suppose that's good news for the town. The ranch employs quite a few men. He asked about you, you know." Eliza's voice took on a conspiratorial tone. Violet's hand stilled. "What do you mean?" "At the mercantile yesterday. Asked if you'd be staying in Promise Creek or moving on. Said it casual-like, but there was nothing casual about the way he was listening for the answer." Violet shook her head. "I'm sure you misunderstood. Mr. Lancaster has no reason to inquire about me." "Men don't need reasons, Violet. They just need eyes." Eliza reached across and squeezed her hand. "And you're still a beautiful woman, widow's weeds or not. A beautiful curse is what folks around here would say." Violet withdrew her hand. 3 husbands dead. "Who would be fool enough to court that kind of luck?" Eliza's face softened. "Not everyone believes in such nonsense," but Violet knew better. She'd seen the way mothers pulled their eligible sons aside when she approached, the way even the most desperate bachelors found excuses to avoid more than polite conversation. In a territory where superstition ran as deep as the silver veins in the mountains, she had become something to fear. The next morning, Violet was arranging a new bolt of calico in her front window when she spotted Garrett Lancaster dismounting from his horse across the street. He stood for a moment, as if gathering his resolve, then strode purposefully toward her shop. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, ducking his head slightly under the frame. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and eyes as blue as the Arizona sky in autumn. "Good morning, Mrs." Brooks, he said, his voice carrying the slight Eastern accent that marked him as not quite belonging, even after 6 months. Mr. Lancaster. Violet nodded formally, setting down her scissors. What can I help you with today? He glanced around the neat shop, seemingly at a loss. I find myself in need of some handkerchiefs. Violet raised an eyebrow but moved professionally to a drawer behind the counter. Plain or monogrammed, sir? Plain would be fine. He approached the counter, his movements careful, deliberate. As she laid out several samples, she noticed his hands strong but clean, with only the beginning calluses of ranch work. They confirmed what everyone said, that he'd been a businessman in Boston before inheriting his uncle's spread. These are 3 cents each, or 10 for 25 cents, Violet said, keeping her voice businesslike. I'll take the 10. His eyes never left her face. As she wrapped the handkerchiefs in brown paper, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Finally, he cleared his throat. Mrs. Brooks, I wonder if I might be direct with you. Violet's hands stilled. I've found directness is usually preferable to the alternative, Mr. Lancaster. A smile tugged at his mouth. Then directly, I understand you're skilled with alterations. I have several shirts that need taking in. I've lost weight since coming west. Violet relaxed marginally. Yes, the desert has that effect on Easterners. You can leave the shirts and I'll have them ready by week's end. I appreciate it. He paid for the handkerchiefs and then hesitated. Mrs. Brooks. Yes. I also wanted to say I'm sorry for your loss. I didn't know your husband well, but the men at the mine spoke highly of him. The unexpected kindness caught her off guard. Thank you, she said softly. That's good to hear. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and left the shop with long strides that spoke of a man unaccustomed to idleness. Violet watched through the window as he crossed back to his horse, wondering why the brief encounter had left her feeling so unsettled. Over the next 2 weeks, Garrett Lancaster found increasingly thin reasons to visit Violet's shop. First, it was the promised shirts for alteration, then a tear in his good jacket that needed mending. Later, he inquired about ordering fabric for new curtains at the ranch house, spending nearly an hour discussing patterns and weights of material. Each time, their conversations grew longer, moving from polite business exchanges to more personal topics. He told her about Boston, about his family's shipping business that he'd left in his brother's hands. She shared stories of growing up in Missouri before coming west with her first husband. What she didn't tell him was how the town had begun to notice his visits, how the whispers followed her more intensely now. Poor Lancaster, they said, doesn't know what he's getting himself into, or worse. Wonder how long before he meets with an accident courting the widow-maker. One Tuesday afternoon, Garrett arrived just as Violet was closing for her midday meal. I won't keep you, he said, noticing her bonnet and basket. I just came to invite you to dinner at the hotel restaurant, tomorrow evening if you're available. Violet stared at him, the invitation so unexpected she momentarily lost her composure. Mr. Lancaster, Garrett, please. Garrett, she amended. I'm not sure that would be wise, his brow furrowed. Because of your recent loss, I understand if it's too soon. No, it's not that. She hesitated, uncertain how to explain without sounding either pitiful or presumptuous. People talk, Mr. Garrett. They especially talk about me, understanding dawned in his eyes. The 3 husbands. Yes, she looked away. They call me cursed, the Black Widow, other names not worth repeating. And you think I care what a bunch of superstitious fools think? There was a hardness to his voice she hadn't heard before. You should care. You're trying to establish yourself here. Your reputation, my reputation, can withstand dinner with a respectable businesswoman. He stepped closer. Unless you simply don't wish to dine with me, in which case I'll trouble you no further. Violet looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or pity. She found neither. Instead, there was a quiet determination that stirred something long dormant inside her. 7 o'clock. She heard herself say, the smile that broke across his face was like sunrise on the mountains. 7 it is, Mrs. Brooks. Violet, she corrected softly. If we're to dine together, you should call me Violet. The Promise Creek Hotel was not grand by Eastern standards, but it was the finest establishment for 50 miles. Its restaurant served real china and linen napkins, and the steak was reportedly the best in the territory. When Violet entered, wearing her best dress navy blue rather than black, her first step away from full morning heads turned and conversations hushed. Garrett stood immediately from his table near the window, coming forward to greet her with a warmth that ignored the stares around them. "You look lovely," he said, just loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. He seated her with the courtesy of a gentleman, and for the first time in years, Violet felt something other than grief or resignation. She felt seen. As they dined, the initial discomfort of being so publicly together faded. Garrett spoke of his plans for the ranch, his ideas for breeding stronger cattle that could better withstand the harsh Arizona summers. Violet found herself sharing her hopes for expanding her shop, perhaps adding millinery services. "You have a good eye for business," he observed. "The way you've maintained your independence is impressive. Necessity is an excellent teacher," she replied. "Each time I was widowed, I had to find a way to support myself. I was fortunate that William left me enough to start the shop." "And your other husbands," she looked down. "Thomas had gambling debts I discovered after his death, and Everett, well, minors don't accumulate much." Garrett's hand moved as if to cover hers but stopped short. "I'm sorry, that couldn't have been easy." "Life rarely is." She managed a small smile, "but I've survived." "That's something, isn't it?" "It's everything," he said with such conviction that she believed him. As the evening wore on, Violet became increasingly aware of the attention they were attracting. Whispers floated across the restaurant, and more than once she caught pitying glances directed at Garrett when Sheriff Mills entered with his wife and deliberately chose a table far from theirs after spotting them. Violet's resolve faltered. "Perhaps we should go," she murmured. This was a mistake. Garrett's jaw tightened as he observed the sheriff's snub. "The only mistake would be letting them dictate our actions." He signaled the waiter. "Bring us coffee and your best apple pie, would you?" The forced normalcy of his order, the quiet defiance in extending their meal rather than retreating, touched Violet deeply. For the first time since she could remember, someone was standing beside her rather than backing away. As they left the hotel later, Garrett offered his arm and Violet took it, conscious of the gazes following them down Promise Creek's main street. "I'll walk you home," he said, his tone brooking no argument. The night air was cool against Violet's flushed cheeks as they strolled in companionable silence. At her door, she turned to thank him. "I had a wonderful evening," she said, surprised to realize how sincerely she meant it, "as did I." He took her hand lightly. "Violet, may I call on you again?" She hesitated, reality reasserting itself. "Garrett, you must know what people will say." "I do." His voice was steady. "And I don't give a damn. You say that now, but I say it because it's true." He squeezed her hand gently. "I've spent my life letting other people's expectations guide me. Coming west was my first real choice, and now I'm making another." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, chaste, proper, yet somehow more intimate than any touch she'd known in years. "Good night, Violet," he said, releasing her hand slowly. "I'll see you soon." She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the moonlit street, wondering if she was dreaming. True to his word, Garrett called on Violet regularly over the next several weeks. They attended church together, drawing stares from the congregation. He escorted her to the town's Independence Day celebration, where they sat slightly apart from the other townsfolk, but enjoyed the fireworks nonetheless. Sometimes he simply appeared at her shop before closing time, ready to walk her home. Each encounter deepened their connection, but also intensified the town's reaction. Business at Violet's shop declined noticeably. Women who had regularly ordered dresses suddenly found seamstresses in neighboring towns. Men who needed mending sent their wives or avoided her services altogether. One afternoon, Violet entered her shop after lunch to find a crude drawing pinned to her door a black spider with a woman's face, surrounded by 3 gravestones. Her hands trembled as she tore it down and crumpled it. That same day, when Garrett arrived at the general store to pick up supplies, he found the owner, Harold Simmons, unusually brusque. Got most of your order, Simmons said, pushing a smaller than expected crate across the counter. Out of coffee and sugar, might be in next week. Garrett frowned. You had plenty when I checked yesterday. Simmons avoided his gaze. Got a big order from the Harper spread this morning. Cleaned me out. I see. Garrett leaned on the counter. And would you be out of supplies if I wasn't keeping company with Mrs. Brooks? The storekeeper's flush was answer enough. I thought we were beyond such foolishness in 1878, Garrett said, his voice dangerously quiet. Perhaps I should take all my ranch business to Tucson from now on. I wonder how that would affect your quarterly numbers, Simmons. The threat of losing the Lancaster account, one of the largest in the region, had immediate effect. Now, Mr. Lancaster, no need for that. I might have a few pounds of coffee and sugar in the back. Let me check. Remarkably, the supplies were found, but the incident left Garrett seething. When he told Violet about it that evening as they sat on the bench outside her shop, she was unsurprised. It's only going to get worse, she said softly, for both of us. Let it. His hand covered hers on the bench between them. Violet, do you know why I decided to stay in Promise Creek when all logic said I should sell the ranch and return east? She shook her head. Because for the first time in my life, I felt like I was making my own path, not following my father's or society's expectations. He turned to face her fully. And then I met you, a woman who's faced unimaginable loss and still stands tall, who rebuilt her life 3 times over, who doesn't need a man but might, I hope, want one anyway. Violet's breath caught. Garrett, I'm falling in love with you, he said simply. And no amount of small-minded gossip is going to change that. Tears sprang to Violet's eyes. You don't understand what you're saying. I've buried 3 husbands. 3. Even if I didn't believe in curses, which I don't, how could I risk loving someone again? How could I watch another man I care for be lowered into the ground? Life comes with no guarantees, Violet, not for anyone. He reached up to brush away a tear from her cheek. But isn't a chance at happiness worth the risk? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Sheriff Mills and 2 deputies reined to a stop before Violet's shop. Mr. Lancaster, the sheriff called, his face grim. There's trouble at your ranch, fire in the south pasture. Your foreman sent word. Garrett stood immediately. How bad? Bad enough. Winds pushing it toward the main house. Without hesitation, Garrett turned to Violet. I have to go, of course, she said, fear gripping her heart. Be careful. He squeezed her hand once more, then mounted his horse, which had been hitched nearby, and galloped off with the sheriff's party. Violet watched until they disappeared from view, a sick feeling in her stomach that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with the knowledge that fire in the dry season could destroy a ranch and the men fighting it in hours. For 3 days, Violet heard nothing from Garrett. The town buzzed with news of the Lancaster ranch fire, which had indeed threatened the main house before being contained. Reports varied. Some said significant acreage had been lost. Others claimed the damage was minimal. All agreed it was suspicious in origin. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Violet was reorganizing her dwindling inventory when the shop bell jangled. She looked up to see Mrs. Thornton, one of Promise Creek's most prominent gossips, entering with her daughter. Mrs. Brooks, the older woman acknowledged stiffly. My Penelope needs a new Sunday dress for the harvest dance next month. Violet masked her surprise at their patronage. Of course, I have some lovely patterns. As she showed the girl various fabrics, Mrs. Thornton wandered the shop, inspecting the merchandise with critical eyes. Heard about the trouble at the Lancaster place, she said casually. Terrible thing, fire. Yes, it is, Violet replied neutrally. They're saying it wasn't an accident. Mrs. Thornton picked up a spool of ribbon, examining it needlessly. Some are saying it's another sign. Violet's hands stilled on the fabric she was showing Penelope. Sign of what, Mrs. Thornton? Well, the woman lowered her voice theatrically. The curse, of course. First 3 husbands and now trouble follows the man who's been courting you, makes one think. Violet straightened, her patience finally exhausted. What exactly are you suggesting, Mrs. Thornton? That I somehow caused a fire miles from town while sitting right here in my shop? The older woman had the grace to look uncomfortable. Now, I never said no, but you implied it clearly enough. Violet carefully refolded the fabric. I think perhaps you should find another seamstress for Penelope's dress. I wouldn't want my curse affecting her chances at the harvest dance. Mrs. Thornton's face flushed. Well, I never come, Penelope. We'll go to Tucson for proper service. She hustled her confused daughter toward the door, pausing only to deliver a parting shot. Mr. Lancaster is a good man from a fine family. It would be a shame if something happened to him because of associations. The bell jangled violently as the door slammed behind them. Violet sank onto her stool, trembling with anger and hurt. Part of her had hoped that Garrett's defense of her might begin to change minds in Promise Creek. Instead, it seemed to have hardened the superstition into something uglier, more deliberate. And now there had been a fire at his ranch, a fire some were already blaming on her indirectly. What if next time it was worse? What if Garrett himself was injured or killed? Could she live with that knowledge? By closing time, Violet had made her decision. With a heavy heart, she began writing a letter explaining why she couldn't see Garrett anymore. It was better this way, better for him, certainly, and perhaps for her too. Better to end things before her feelings grew even deeper. She was sealing the envelope when a knock came at her door. Thinking it was Eliza, who often checked on her in the evenings, Violet called out, "It's open." The door swung wide to reveal Garrett, his face smudged with soot, his clothes bearing the unmistakable smell of smoke. He looked exhausted but whole, and the sight of him made Violet's heart clench painfully. "Garrett," she stood, the letter still in her hand. "I heard about the fire. Are you all right? Tired? Dirty?" He attempted a smile, "But better now that I'm seeing you." She wanted to go to him, to touch him and assure herself he was truly unharmed, but the letter in her hand held her back. The ranch, was there much damage? Lost about 40 acres of good grazing land and some fencing. He rubbed the back of his neck wearily. Could have been much worse if the wind had shifted. They're saying it wasn't an accident. His expression hardened. It wasn't. Someone said it deliberately. We found where it started, multiple points of origin. Do they know who? She asked, though she feared the answer. Not yet. But Sheriff Mills is investigating. He stepped further into the room, noticing the letter for the first time. What's that? Violet looked down at the envelope, her name for him written in her neat hand. It's nothing, Violet. His voice was gentle but firm. Please don't lie to me. With reluctance, she held out the letter. It's for you. I was going to send it tomorrow. He took it, his eyes questioning, but didn't open it. Will you tell me what it says? It says I can't see you anymore. The words hurt as they left her mouth. That it's better for both of us if we end things now. I see. He placed the unopened letter on the table beside him. And did you mean it when you wrote it? Yes, she whispered. I think so. Garrett, today Mrs. Thornton all but accused me of causing the fire through some sort of curse. People are connecting what happened at your ranch to us. And you believe them? His voice held no judgment, only a genuine desire to understand. No, of course not, but someone started that fire, Garrett. Someone who might be trying to warn you away from me. She wrapped her arms around herself. What if next time it's worse? What if you're hurt because of me? He closed the distance between them, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. Violet, look at me. Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. I didn't fight that fire for 3 days to come back and lose you to fear. Not your fear, and certainly not the fear of small-minded people. His grip tightened slightly. The fire was set by Cyrus Welch, my former foreman, the one I fired when I took over the ranch. Violet blinked in confusion. How do you know? Because the sheriff arrested him this afternoon. He was drunk at the Broken Spoke, bragging about how he'd shown Lancaster, who's boss, had burned gloves in his saddlebag, and witnesses who saw him riding from the direction of my ranch that night. His mouth twisted wryly. Not the cleverest criminal. Relief flooded through Violet, followed quickly by embarrassment. I know what you thought. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. And I understand why. You've been made to feel responsible for tragedies that were never your fault. But Violet, I need you to understand something. I'm not afraid of loving you. The word loving hung in the air between them, more meaningful now than when he'd said he was falling in love. This was present tense, certain. You should be, she said, her voice breaking. Everyone else is. Everyone else is a fool. He drew her closer. I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of how I feel about you. And then he was kissing her, his lips warm and insistent against hers. Violet's resistance melted away as she pressed herself against him, returning his kiss with years of pent-up loneliness and longing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. Tell me you'll stop pushing me away. Tell me you'll give us a real chance. In that moment, looking into his earnest blue eyes, Violet made her own choice. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will, he smiled, bright and genuine despite his exhaustion. Good, because I have every intention of asking you to marry me, Violet Brooks. Not today, not before you're ready, but someday soon. The words sent a shiver of both fear and anticipation through her. Garrett, the town will have to accept us or not. I don't much care which. He kissed her again, more gently this time. Now I need to get back to the ranch. There's much to be done after the fire, but I wanted to see you first to make sure you knew I was all right. I'm glad you came, she said softly. As he turned to leave, she caught his hand. Garrett, be careful on the ride back. It's getting dark. He squeezed her fingers. I will. I have something precious to come back for. The arrest of Cyrus Welch for the Lancaster Ranch fire briefly diverted the town's attention from Violet and Garrett's relationship, but not for long. As autumn approached and their courtship continued openly, the whispers evolved from superstitious fear to more practical concerns. He's a businessman, Violet overheard as she selected vegetables at the market. Must be after her shop, only explanation. Heard she's with child, another voice speculated. Why else would he be sticking around? The cruelest comments came from the young women who had set their sights on Promise Creek's most eligible newcomer. He'll tire of her soon enough, they assured each other. Once the novelty of bedding a widow wears off. Violet bore it all with outward dignity, though each barb stung. She focused instead on the joy Garrett brought into her life, their long rides into the desert to picnic in the shadow of red rock formations, their discussions of books they both loved, the quiet evenings sitting on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. For the first time since she could remember, Violet began to hope for a future beyond mere survival. Garrett, for his part, seemed oblivious to the gossip. He went about rebuilding his ranch, introducing new breeding stock, and expanding his operations with the confidence of a man who knew his own mind. When he was in town, he made no secret of his affection for Violet, often bringing her wildflowers or small gifts from his infrequent trips to Tucson. By late September, Violet's shop had lost enough business that she began to worry about making rent. Though she never mentioned her financial concerns to Garrett, he noticed the increasingly sparse shelves and dwindling customer traffic. Let me help, he offered one evening as they walked along Promise Creek itself, the waterway that had given the town its name, just until things improve. I can't take your money, Garrett, Violet said firmly. I've always supported myself. It wouldn't be charity. Think of it as an investment. When she looked skeptical, he elaborated. The ranch hands need proper clothes. Right now, they ride all the way to Tucson for decent shirts and trousers. If they could get quality goods here in town, it would save time and money. You'd order from me instead of Tucson? Of course, it makes good business sense. He grinned. The fact that I'm sweet on the proprietress is merely a happy coincidence. Despite her reservations, Violet agreed. The arrangement proved beneficial for both. Her shop received a much-needed influx of business, while Garrett's ranch hands got quality clothing without the long ride to Tucson. What neither of them anticipated was how this business relationship would fuel new rumors. She's got him wrapped around her finger, the town's barber told his customers. Mark my words, she'll bleed his ranch dry before she's done. Sheriff Mills, who had gradually warmed to Garrett since the fire incident, felt obliged to speak to him man to man. Lancaster, he said, stopping by the ranch one afternoon in early October. Got a minute? They stood on the broad porch of the ranch house, surveying the newly repaired corral where horses milled in the autumn sunshine. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Mills shifted uncomfortably. It's about Mrs. Brooks. Garrett's expression cooled noticeably. What about her? Look, I'm not one for superstition. I don't believe in curses or any such nonsense. The sheriff removed his hat, turning it in his hands. But there's talk about your business arrangements with her shop. People are saying she's taking advantage. People talk too much in this town, Garrett replied evenly, and know too little. I'm just concerned as your friend. 3 husbands dying young, it makes folks wonder. Wonder what exactly? Garrett's tone had turned dangerous. Whether she pushed William off that cliff, he died of pneumonia, Sheriff, or whether she spooked Thomas's horse. Half the town witnessed that accident, or perhaps she caused the mining collapse that killed Everett and 2 other men. Mills raised his hands placatingly. Now, I never suggested, but others have, and you're carrying their water. Garrett's disappointment was palpable. I expected better from you. I'm just trying to look out for you, son. I don't need looking after. What I need is for this town to show Violet the respect she deserves as a businesswoman and a person who's endured more grief than most of us will ever know. Garrett stepped closer to the sheriff. And if you're truly my friend, you'll help make that happen instead of perpetuating harmful gossip. Mills replaced his hat, recognizing a lost cause when he saw one. You're a grown man. I've said my piece. As the sheriff rode away, Garrett leaned against the porch railing, his frustration evident. He loved Promise Creek and the freedom he'd found here, but the town's treatment of Violet was testing his patience. Something needed to change, and soon. The annual Harvest Dance was Promise Creek's most anticipated social event. Held in the town hall on the last Saturday of October, it brought together ranchers, miners, shopkeepers, and their families for a night of music, food, and celebration before the harsher winter months. Violet had not attended since Thomas's death 3 years earlier, finding the pitying glances and whispered comments too painful to bear. This year, however, Garrett was determined they should go together. It's the perfect opportunity to show everyone that we're serious, he argued when she hesitated. That this isn't some passing fancy or scandalous arrangement, or it could be the perfect opportunity for public humiliation, Violet countered. What if no one speaks to us? What if they refuse to dance with either of us? Then we'll dance with each other all night, he said simply, and have a better time for it. In the end, his optimism won out. Violet spent her sparse savings on fabric for a new dress, deep burgundy silk that complemented her auburn hair and fair complexion. When Garrett came to escort her on the night of the dance, the appreciation in his eyes made every penny worthwhile. You are a vision, he said, his voice hushed with admiration. Violet smoothed the skirt nervously. Is it too much, too bold a color for a widow? It's perfect. He offered his arm. Shall we? The town hall had been transformed with autumn decorations, corn husks, pumpkins, and paper lanterns, creating a warm, festive atmosphere. A small band played in the corner, and tables laden with food lined one wall. Nearly everyone in Promise Creek was present, from the wealthiest ranch owners to the humblest miners. When Violet and Garrett entered, a momentary hush fell over the crowd before conversations resumed with forced normality. They made their way to the punch table, where Eliza Woodson greeted them with genuine warmth. About time you showed your face at one of these, she told Violet, and in such a stunning dress, you'll put all these young girls to shame. Garrett accepted 2 cups of punch from her. I've been telling her the same thing. For the first hour, they remained largely isolated, speaking only with the few townspeople who approached them. Eliza, the school teacher Miss Perkins, and surprisingly, Harold Simmons from the general store, who had apparently reconsidered his position after Garrett threatened to take his business elsewhere. When the band struck up a waltz, Garrett set down his punch cup decisively. May I have this dance, Mrs. Brooks? Violet hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. You may, Mr. Lancaster. They moved onto the dance floor, where other couples quickly made space, too much space around them. Violet felt the weight of stares as Garrett's hand settled at her waist, but as they began to move in perfect rhythm, the rest of the room seemed to fade away. You dance beautifully, she remarked, surprised by his grace. "Mandatory lessons at my mother's insistence." His smile was rueful. "I complained bitterly at the time, but I find myself grateful now." They completed one circuit of the floor in their own bubble of contentment before Violet noticed Mrs. Thornton and her circle watching them with undisguised disapproval. "Don't look now, but I believe we're scandalizing the matrons," she murmured. "Good." It's about time they had something legitimate to gossip about rather than manufacturing superstitious nonsense. He pulled her slightly closer. "Are you enjoying yourself despite them?" "More than I expected," she admitted. Though it would be nice if she broke off as she noticed Sheriff Mills approaching with his wife. For a moment, Violet feared he meant to cut in and separate them, perhaps under some pretense of propriety. Instead, the sheriff and Mrs. Mills positioned themselves to dance alongside them, offering a nod of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but a significant one, the town's law enforcement publicly accepting their relationship. As the dance continued, Eliza and her husband joined the floor as well, deliberately moving near them. By the time the waltz ended, 2 more couples had followed suit. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was a start. "See," Garrett whispered as he escorted her from the floor. "Not everyone in this town is a fool." The evening progressed with a gradual thawing. More people approached their table for conversation. Violet even overheard Mrs. Collins, the baker's wife, remark, "They do make a handsome couple, curse or no curse." It wasn't until after the midnight supper that Garrett's true intentions for the evening became clear. As the band took a brief intermission, he asked them for a moment of their time, slipping the leader what appeared to be a generous tip. The band leader nodded and stepped forward, calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Lancaster would like to say a few words." A curious hush fell over the gathering as Garrett moved to the center of the dance floor. He looked around the room, his gaze finding Violet where she stood near their table. "Folks of Promise Creek," he began, his voice carrying clearly. "I came to this territory a stranger inheriting a ranch I initially had no intention of keeping, but this land has a way of getting under your skin. So do its people, some of them, at least." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. "Tonight, I want to speak directly to a particular citizen of Promise Creek, a woman who has shown more courage, resilience, and dignity than anyone I've ever known." He turned fully toward Violet, extending his hand. "Mrs. Brooks, would you join me?" Violet felt her cheeks flush as all eyes turned to her. With trembling legs, she walked to where Garrett stood, taking his outstretched hand. "Violet Brooks has endured more loss than most of us can imagine," he continued, addressing the room but looking only at her. "She has rebuilt her life multiple times. She has run a successful business on her own. And she has done it all while facing whispers, suspicion, and unkindness from many in this community." The room grew uncomfortably quiet as his words hit home. "Some call her cursed. I call her the strongest woman I've ever met." His voice softened. "And the woman I love." Gasps and murmurs spread across the hall as Garrett lowered himself to one knee, still holding Violet's hand. "Violet, I know you've been hurt. I know you've been afraid to love again. But if you'll have me, I promise to stand by you against whatever life brings, be it fire, flood, or foolish gossip." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Violet's eyes as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small but perfect diamond. The world seemed to stop as she looked from the ring to his hopeful face, aware that every person in Promise Creek was witnessing this moment. 3 times she had married, each time with quiet ceremonies conducted with pragmatic expectations rather than romantic hopes. 3 times she had buried husbands. And yet here was this man, this wonderful, stubborn man, offering his heart to her in front of the very people who had ostracized her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder as joy overwhelmed caution. "Yes, Garrett, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to his feet, gathering her into his arms for a kiss that defied propriety but felt absolutely right. When they separated, breathless and smiling, they turned to face the town. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, from the back of the hall, a single person began to clap. Eliza, Violet realized with a rush of gratitude. The schoolteacher joined in, then Sheriff Mills and his wife. Soon, the applause spread, not unanimous but significant, drowning out the disapproving murmurs. As the band struck up again a joyful, sprightly tune, Garrett drew Violet back into a dance, this time joined immediately by several other couples. "That was quite a performance," she said, still dazed by what had just occurred. "Not a performance," he corrected gently. "A declaration. I wanted everyone to know exactly where I stand, where we stand together." As they danced, Violet noticed Mrs. Thornton and several other matrons slipping out the side door, their disapproval evident. But for every person who left, it seemed another approach to offer cautious congratulations. "Bold move, Lancaster," Sheriff Mills commented later, clasping Garrett's hand firmly, "but a good one. About time someone challenged the nonsense around here." He nodded respectfully to Violet. "Mrs. Brooks, my congratulations to you as well." By the time they left the dance well after midnight, something had shifted in Promise Creek's treatment of Violet. Not complete acceptance, perhaps, but a crack in the wall of superstition that had surrounded her for so long. Walking home under the star-filled sky, Garrett's arm secure around her waist, Violet allowed herself to truly believe in a future for the first time in years. November wedding. Garrett suggested as they reached her door, "So soon." "I've waited long enough to make you my wife." He brushed a kiss against her temple. "Unless you need more time," Violet considered. A short engagement would mean less time for the town's opinion to sway back against them, less time for doubt to creep into her own heart. "November sounds perfect, but nothing elaborate, just us, the Reverend, and whatever friends wish to attend. Whatever you want." He kissed her properly this time. "As long as I get to call you Mrs. Lancaster by Christmas." The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Despite Violet's desire for simplicity, Eliza insisted on helping her create a proper wedding dress. Business at the shop gradually improved as news of the engagement spread and curiosity overcame prejudice. Even a few of the women who had abandoned her services returned, ostensibly to offer congratulations, but clearly also to assess the situation firsthand. Garrett, meanwhile, threw himself into readying the ranch house for his bride. He hired painters and carpenters to refresh the somewhat neglected building, ordered new furniture from Tucson, and expanded the small garden that his aunt had once maintained. "It won't be as convenient as living above your shop," he acknowledged when showing Violet the improvements, "but we'll have space to grow." The implications of his words, a family, children, a legacy beyond loss, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "It's wonderful," she assured him. "More than I ever thought to have again." Not everything proceeded smoothly, of course. Anonymous notes were left at the shop, warning Garrett of his impending doom if he married the widow-maker. The worst incident came 2 weeks before the wedding, when Violet arrived one morning to find her shop window shattered and "Cursed" painted across the door in red. Sheriff Mills investigated but found no witnesses willing to come forward. Garrett was livid, offering a substantial reward for information, but Violet counseled patience. "People fear what they don't understand," she said as they cleaned up the mess together, "and 3 dead husbands is hard to understand." "It's not hard at all," he countered, sweeping up broken glass with more force than necessary. "It's called tragedy, not curse, and using it as an excuse for vandalism is criminal, not superstitious." Despite the setbacks, their wedding day dawned clear and mild, unusual for mid-November in the territory. They had chosen to marry in the small church rather than at the ranch, deliberately placing their union in the heart of the community that had both rejected and was slowly beginning to accept them. Reverend Parker, who had initially expressed private reservations to Garrett about performing the ceremony, had come around after several long conversations. "Love is God's greatest gift," he told them during their final meeting before the wedding. "Who am I to stand in its way?" The church was more full than Violet had dared hope. Besides Eliza and her husband, Sheriff and Mrs. Mills, and the ranch hands who had become fiercely loyal to Garrett, at least 20 other townspeople had chosen to attend. They sat primarily on the groom's side, but their presence itself was meaningful. Violet wore a gown of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, elegant, but appropriately subdued for a widow's fourth marriage. Garrett, waiting at the altar in his best black suit, watched her approach with such naked adoration that whispers of "beautiful and lucky man" rippled through the congregation. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with unmistakable conviction. When Reverend Parker pronounced them man and wife, Garrett's kiss was both tender and possessive, a public claim that silenced the last doubts in Violet's mind. The small reception at the Promise Creek Hotel was surprisingly festive. Harold Simmons, seemingly determined to make amends for his earlier coldness, provided champagne at a generous discount. Mrs. Collins contributed a wedding cake that Violet suspected represented her finest work. Even Dr. Wilson, who had attended all three of Violet's husbands in their final illnesses, offered sincere good wishes. "Fourth time's the charm, Mrs. Lancaster," he said, using her new name deliberately. "Though I hope not to see either of you professionally for many years to come." By sunset, the newlyweds departed for the ranch, leaving behind a town irrevocably altered by their defiance of convention and superstition. Life, as Mrs. Lancaster, brought changes both expected and surprising. Violet maintained her shop, riding into town 3 days a week while employing a local girl, Jenny Parker, the Reverend's niece, to handle the counter on other days. The arrangement allowed her to balance her business with her new role as mistress of the Lancaster Ranch. The first time she wore her wedding ring into the general store, Harold Simmons offered her the same preferential pricing he gave the largest ranchers' wives. When she raised an eyebrow, he shrugged uncomfortably. "Lancaster's one of our most important customers now. Only makes sense." It wasn't an apology for past treatment, but Violet accepted it as the olive branch it was intended to be. Gradually, other small courtesies followed. Invitations to ladies' socials began arriving. Her opinion on town improvements was solicited at public meetings. The word "cursed" faded from whispered conversations, replaced by discussions of the ranch's prosperity under the Lancasters' management. For his part, Garrett proved to be everything Violet had hoped for in a husband and more. He treated her as a partner in both business and life, valuing her practical insights and supporting her independence, even as he cherished their intimacy. On cold winter evenings, they would sit before the fire in the ranch house parlor, reading aloud to each other or simply talking, building the foundation of a marriage based on genuine friendship as well as passion. By spring, Promise Creek had largely accepted the Lancasters as one of its leading families. When Violet announced her pregnancy in April 1879, the news was met with genuine congratulations rather than dire predictions. "We'll need to hire more help at the shop," she told Garrett as they sat on the porch swing he had installed for her, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. Her hand rested on her still flat stomach, wonder in her voice. "I never thought I'd have this chance." He covered her hand with his own. "I always knew what? That we would build something special together." He kissed her temple. "A family, a legacy, a life that defies anyone's expectations but our own." As her pregnancy progressed, Violet found herself the unexpected recipient of baby blankets, tiny garments, and practical advice from the very women who had once crossed the street to avoid her. The transformation in the town's attitude was so complete that by the time their daughter Grace was born in November 1879, exactly 1 year after their wedding, a steady stream of visitors came to the ranch bearing gifts and good wishes. "Looks just like her mother, Mrs. Thornton declared, peering into the cradle at the infant with her shock of auburn hair. The woman who had once been Violet's harshest critic now seemed determined to be first in line to admire the newest Lancaster. "Poor child, if that's true," Violet joked, her confidence restored by happiness and acceptance. Mrs. Thornton looked up sharply, then surprised everyone by laughing. "Nonsense, you were always a beauty, Mrs. Lancaster. That's half the reason the gossip was so vicious. Jealousy is an ugly thing." It was perhaps the closest thing to an apology Violet would ever receive, and she accepted it with grace. As Grace grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered under Garrett's innovative management. He introduced new breeding techniques, expanded into sheep as well as cattle, and built a reputation for fair dealings that brought customers from as far as California. Violet's shop likewise thrived, eventually expanding to include a millinery section run by Jenny Parker, who had proven to have quite a talent for hat making. In the spring of 1882, with Grace approaching 3 and the ranch more successful than ever, Garrett and Violet hosted a barbecue for the entire town, a deliberate echo of the traditional gatherings that Garrett's uncle had held in Promise Creek's earlier days. As they watched their neighbors and friends mingle on the ranch's sprawling lawn, Grace chasing butterflies with the other children, Garrett slipped his arm around Violet's waist. "Happy?" he asked, though her expression answered the question. "Completely." She leaned into his embrace. "You know, when you proposed at the harvest dance, I was terrified, not of marrying you, but of what it might bring: more tragedy, more loss. And now I understand that living in fear of loss means never truly living at all." She turned in his arms to face him fully. "You taught me that, Garrett Lancaster, you and Promise Creek, oddly enough. The town that once shunned you, the town that learned to see beyond superstition." She smiled. "People can change, communities can heal. And widows can find love again, even when no one, including themselves, believes it possible." As the afternoon sun gilded the desert landscape around them, Garrett kissed his wife with the same passion that had defied convention 4 years earlier. Their story had become part of Promise Creek's lore, not as a cautionary tale of curses and tragedy, but as proof that courage and love could overcome even the most entrenched prejudice. And when Grace was joined by a brother, William Garrett Lancaster, in 1883, and later by twins Thomas and Everett in 1885, named in honor of the husbands Violet, had lost, the town celebrated each birth as enthusiastically as if the children were their own collective triumph over fear and small-mindedness. The widow no one wanted had become the woman everyone admired, her curse transformed into a blessing that touched not only her own family, but the entire community that had once rejected her. And the cowboy who had asked for her hand in front of them, all had proven that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to love without reservation, regardless of what others might think or say. In the years that followed, whenever new settlers arrived in Promise Creek and heard whispers of the town's past superstitions, they were quickly directed to the Lancaster Ranch to see for themselves how thoroughly those old fears had been disproven. There they would find Violet and Garrett, surrounded by their children, and the life they had built together a testament to the power of love to heal, to transform, and ultimately to endure.